So Martin, you've had a broad range of experience across government and seen many, many examples of best practice in terms of digital transformation. Are you able to share some of those examples with us?
I have been thinking a bit about this, and I think it's a tough gig in a way, the whole game, I think, doing this digital transformation bit well. Because again, talking of my obsession with paradoxes, it seems sometimes like a combination of opposites, and in a sense that's probably right. But again, if I can just refer to a couple of things that I jotted down, the kind of list that I would put together, and I wrote here demanding list, and it is very demanding, would be things like speed, for sure. That is important. But we also want depth. We want empathy. We do want a certain amount of impatience. We do want people to say, no, we've got to cut through. I get that. We do need that. But at the same time, we need understanding and insight. We need some emotional intelligence here. And at the risk of putting some of my best digital friends offside slightly, there is a case to be made that sometimes the digital evangelist, perhaps quite rightly in a sense, is so focused on driving their agenda that they don't often perhaps give themselves enough time to engage with that kind of emotional intelligence about the context and place that they're working in. So emotional intelligence, as well as digital and business depth. We've got to connect change to design and digital. I think sometimes digital people say they're interested in the change piece, but actually don't always feel comfortable driving that next piece. Whereas I think some of the best genuinely change-driven people I've met in the digital world, they understand how you put digital, design and change together. I think in very powerful ways. I think you've got to know when to press your case, and you've got to know when to step back. You've got to know when to talk a lot, and you've got to know when to stop talking. It sounds difficult, right? And that's because it is difficult. And I think if we understand that complex mix of factors that need to play, then I think we're going to make a lot more progress. But at the moment, I'm not sure some of our best digital transformers, if you like, are perhaps sufficiently manifesting that mix and contradictory set of ideas. Anyway, that to me is kind of best practice. It's a bit of a ragbag, but I think those kind of elements are becoming increasingly important.
So given what you've just said, how does an effective leader in a digital transformation project know when to speak out and lead and when to shut up?
Yes, that's such a great question, isn't it? I suppose if I knew the answer to that question, I'd probably be a very rich man. It's an art much more than it is a science. I'm rapidly coming to that conclusion, and as you can tell now, I've been in this business for rather longer than I care to admit. Organisationally and from a management point of view, that is a difficult game. It's an art form to know when to push and when to stop. One of the things that I think I would say is that sometimes, again at the risk of perhaps putting a slightly controversial story into our conversation, I think digital people have just got to get a little bit better at listening. I know that sounds a bit odd, because I think they are listening all the time, but actually, particularly given their impatience and their desire to drive this fabulous new revolution, and I'm right with them, right? I want them to be successful. I think sometimes they don't stop and just wait a minute. Let me just listen to what this person, this very senior bureaucrat, this very tired and stressed minister is telling me. What am I hearing about the nature of the complications that they're trying to wrangle? How do I kind of build that into what I'm about to tell them, as opposed to, well, I'm going to listen to what they're going to say. I'm not going to hear a thing they actually said to me, and I'm still going to tell them that what they need is, a much better website, or get on Twitter, or do something digital, because it'll sort of fix everything. So I think we've got to listen a bit more, right? I think we just got to be a wee bit more. As a number of people have said to me, sometimes we will have to just pause a moment, and I wonder sometimes in our digital enthusiasm we just don't pause enough. I'm not sure I've got a kind of deeply scientific answer to this stuff, but I just think a certain amount of listening and emotional empathy wouldn't be a bad place to start.
So listening to what you've been saying, I'm thinking about the bureaucrats and senior policymakers who have been in their world for a career, for a very long time, and know that world deeply in the way that you're outlining. Lots of complexity, lots of constraints. But with that comes the fact that they may stop thinking laterally and being prepared to think outside the square. So I guess, listening to what you're saying, how much scope is there for them to shift position?
Some of the ideas I'm trying to grapple with here, and I am grappling with this stuff, as you can tell, I'm thinking this through still. It can sound like a bit of an apologist, right, for, oh, well, government is complicated and difficult. And gosh, how many times have I heard that story? Yeah, it's easy for you people in, Uber and Airbnb and Twitter and so on. That's a digital world. This is our world. So I get that, and I think that's a very fair point. And I think there is a sense that, to the extent I'm giving some advice here to some of my digital colleagues, if you like, and as I say, I firmly plant myself in that camp. The truth is I spend as much time in the other camp. I came to this conversation out of government and out of a policy and strategy role, not out of a technology role. And yes, I think you're dead right. I think as much advice needs to go to ministers, senior bureaucrats, and folks who are being somewhat stubborn, frankly, about their willingness to, get out of the groove and recognise that actually digital genuinely is changing everything. There is no question about that. And yes, to some extent, there is a kind of get on board or get off. I get that. And I think it's a very fair balance that you've introduced into the conversation, because the risk is that we're sort of suggesting, the digital end of this conversation's got to be all giving, and we just have to put up with it, whatever crap, as it were, we get thrown at by the deep, dark mysteries of the bureaucracy. We do not. That is true, and we've got to be demanding, and we've got to say to folks, no, these things apply to you as well. And hopefully somewhere in between that, we've got a real sense that there's a coming together. But it's a very fair point, and it's a well-made point. I absolutely take it.
So another observation that I'd have is that, we've had departments focusing on deregulation. In fact, we've had a Federal Department of Finance and deregulation. We've got better regulation in New South Wales. It seems to me that there's not just red tape, but listening to somebody in government recently, she said that there was also beige tape. In other words, as part of digital transformation, people inside agencies need to look at the rules and regulations and procedures that they've created that go unchallenged year after year, but aren't necessarily enshrined in legislation or have any long-term valid basis to be there. How much scope do you think there is for people to fundamentally have a look at some of these things?
I think that's right, and I'd go back to the our earlier comments about the shift from doing to being digital. If you start from the premise that digital is in your mindset from the start, you ask very deep questions about why we're doing something in the first place, because there may be a way of getting the outcome that we're after without doing it the way we're doing it now. Couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. And I think increasingly, it's interesting in New South Wales, right? We have a Minister for Innovation and Better Regulation. Maybe that's a step, and that's terrific. And Victor Dominello is running a very good, if I can just plug a small hometown advantage, as it were. I think Victor Dominello is doing a great job in that regard. But I think you're dead right. I think the regulatory end of this, and I had some conversations recently in Western Australia, interestingly, around the regulatory implications of the new economy, I think are very profound. And I think I have found what I would call the more interesting and challenging end of the regulatory industry inside the public sector, very, very, very aware now that they are being challenged to think quite fundamentally about why they do certain things and why they've got certain rules in place, because they reflected an era and an age and a particular way of getting an outcome that has simply been rendered totally different now. So they have to start thinking quite differently. So I think it's a great point, and I think it's beginning to seep into that level of the conversation.
So you've talked in the past about the need to meet in the middle. Could you elaborate for us on how we might do that?
I think that's a great point. I think it's interesting when we look back, say, over the last 5 years, and I'll take the government digital service in the UK as a bit of a bellwether, because everyone tends to do that, a bit of a gold standard, I guess. It's interesting to read Mike Bracken talking about how, in effect, he and his team were, almost parachuted into the middle of Whitehall and, sort of like going behind enemy lines, right, and changing from within. Fantastic idea and very powerful in many respects. But I think a risk, and I think the risk that comes from that kind of approach is that you end up setting up teams that are sort of standing a bit apart and don't really get engaged with or feel part of the main business. So it's always a difficult thing, I know. You need to corral those resources. You do need special resources. So yes, they have to be sort of special and a little bit separate. But in that separateness, I think, is a big, big risk. So coming back to your point, I think where we are heading in the next, I hope, say 5 to 10 years or even earlier, 3 to 5 years, let's not be too far out, is that we are going to have to work out how we keep these teams very focused, very engaged, specialist in that sense, but not so apart, not so, if you like, distant, standing a little bit away from the real business of government in terms of some of the comments I've been making earlier. If we can find those special teams willing to invest the time and effort to understand deeply the business that they're trying to transform, they may have a much better chance of transforming it. So that's probably where we're going to get to, I think, in the next phase. Perhaps initially we had to go through this first phase where the advanced party has to be dropped in, as I say, behind enemy lines to start working the revolution. Now maybe we're in a slightly different phase where I think we've got more people who are, as it were, less resistant. So let's kind of start joining forces with them, right? A little bit more of a meeting in the middle, as you say. I think that's kind of a nice way of putting it. And I would love to think that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to hear far fewer stories about senior bureaucrats and ministers saying, oh, all this digital stuff, I don't get it, and they don't understand my world. Let's see if we can't get some evidence that suggests, no, these people are really beginning to get us. And they're right, we do have to change. And I think they've got some things to help, and so on and so forth. You get that kind of new conversation. That would be wonderful. And in a very hopeful sense, I think we all have to be optimists, right? All digital transformers are optimists, I was once told, and I think that's true. So let's be optimistic. I think that's where maybe in the next 3 to 5 years we might end up. I certainly hope so. And like a lot of people in the rooms that you've been talking to and in the worlds that I move in, I think that's where we all would love to end up.
Martin, thank you so much. That was really informative and interesting.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.